It's almost good afternoon, but greetings everyone. In the upcoming minutes I will talk about a paleodemographic approach studied on the Avar Period population. My presentation won't involve any kind of genetic results. It will be a topic for an upcoming presentation, so it's mostly based on osteological data and a bit of statistics. I'm sorry for that. But no, we are changing from the individual data to a bit more holistic population level approach. Prior we delve into the more details of the paleodemographic profile, I would like to provide you a bit of context from archaeological, historical, and biological point of view. The Avars were an eastern originated tribal confederation who came into the Carpathian Basin at the end of the 6th century. They conquered basically the entire territory of this region, and they founded a long-lasting, rather eastern type empire in the Carpathian Basin. They subjugated the population who lived here at the time of the conquest, but quite surprisingly to the bad renommee of the Avars, actually the coexistence in the Carpathian Basin was a rather peaceful way, at least in many levels. Why we can think that? If you take a look into the archaeological profile image of the early Avar period, especially in the Trans-Danubian region, it is characterized actually a very multicultural milieu with the presence of Byzantine, late antique Germanic element alongside with the steppe-related objects and traditions. And it's a very justified question that what is the origin of those a bit out-of-scope elements in the Trans-Danubian Avar Empire, whether are they just stolen from different region and people, or actually there is a people who made this style of objects who are following the fashion because of those objects. And based on our knowledge so far, we can say quite confidently that there is a very strong community in the Trans-Danubian region survived during the Avar period, and actually they were thriving during this era, and they just formed a rather peaceful coexistence because these Germanic elements are appearing in a very independent strata in the hierarchy as soldiers as well, and also we have princely furnished Germanic elites almost comparable with the Merovingian world. What is happening during the middle and the late Avar period? After the failed siege of Constantinople, out of the Carpathian Basin polity of the Avar Empire has changed a bit, and now they are more focused into the internal territories of the Carpathian Basin. And there is a sudden and very surprisingly prompt transformation of the material culture, what was characterized in the early Avar period. So this former multicultural milieu just started to unify into a very, very unified picture, which is characterized for the entire territory of the Carpathian Basin. And this process actually happened during a very short time period. And beside this unification, there is an appearance of new type of artifacts. And what is very important from demographic point of view, a lot of changes from the demographic aspects that can be seen in the archaeological material as well, as there are plenty of new cemeteries are opening with a size of more 1,000 individuals as well, and also the density of those cemeteries and settlements are increasing in the Carpathian Basin. Of course, we can have a question that what is the reason why this kind of demographical changes can happen during this time? And there is hypothesis that probably migration from outer territories can have a role in that. But nowadays we think it's rather an internal process and internal transformation, and eventually the result of giving up a more mobile way of life and start to resettling the former territories of the Carpathian Basin. In our analysis, the key point is the site in Baranya County, close to the Mohács Plain and the Danube in southern Hungary, Kölked-Feketekapu. This site is a key site in Trans-Danubia because these processes I have just described before actually can be observed in its entirety in the archaeological history of the site. Because it's used in the entire period of our epoch, we can assume a very strong local community with Germanic and late antique traditions, and early infiltrations of our overlords and the Avar, and afterwards basically just the commingling of the individuals bearing different traditions in the same site, and the late Avar transformation can be observed actually in the same manner I've just described to you. The other reason why it's very useful to our analysis is that actually there is an abundant amount of skeletal remains from the sites for which now we have analyzed more than 1,000 individuals from this entire period. I now just showed you separately the Kölked A and Kölked B because we are very lucky with this site because we have the settlements as well, which is Kölked-B, and there are individuals buried in the courtyards of the settlement households, and there is a typical row cemetery, Ryan Graberfeld, which is constituted with the Kölked-A cemetery. So there is a plenty of individuals from both sides. Based on the percentages, you can see that the ratio of individuals under 20 years of age is quite nice, but of course, if it would be truly trustworthy, we would expect a bit more individuals under 20 years of age. I will talk about later. And what we're going to study on these non-adult individuals is actually we use a proxy to analyze the potential growth and fertility. And afterward, we'll analyze the probability of survival of the subadults, and eventually we will need the method to decide whether is there any kind of differences between these survival probabilities. Yes. About just the basic demographic pictures of the non-adult individuals, you can see here in this interval age categories and point estimate age categories, because in the case, if we have a rather precise estimate with an interval of 1 on the 1.5 years, we just use this midpoint of those intervals to have a possibility to use a bit more sophisticated statistical method. So we were able to depict this with the density histogram there, this handling the age data as a continuous value. And you can observe that actually we have a very low proportion of neonates and very young infants, which unfortunately it's a typical phenomenon in historical context. But afterward we have a quite trustworthy amount and proportion for the subadult individuals. Due to the archaeological work and context, we're able to categorize the periodization of those subadults into the early, middle, late division typical for the Avar period. And afterward, we just decide to make a comparison between the rather early and the rather late Avar period subadults individuals, so that this site is quite potential to useful to study is there any kind of impact of the Avar period cultural transformation on the subadult survival pattern. Afterward, we just divided our sample into this early and late one, and it's quite surprisingly the distribution of the age groups is quite the same as the pooled sample. So there is no difference between the early and the later phase regarding the age distribution of the subadults, and there is no significant difference between them. This typical bimodel, the very large proportion for the younger subadults, and also a second mode around the juvenile age group. For the proxy for fertility and growth rate, we use this P index, which is basically just the proportion of individuals dies between the age of 5 and 19 divided by the individuals dies above 5 years of age. It's a very simplistic ratio, and it's quite useful because, as you've seen, it rules out the number of the very young individuals, so that if the sample is biased because of the absence of those individuals, this kind of data still can't be useful. Given the comparison of the early and the late one, the numbers are quite the same and the confidence intervals overlap quite nicely, so that based on those proxies for growth rate and fertility, we can't expect a large differences between the early and the late phase of the Kölked-Feketekapu site. Afterward, we just switched to the analysis of these probability of the survival between the early and the late sample. For the analysis, we just ruled out individuals dies before the age of 2 because they were very underrepresented. So that's the reason why actually we have the highest value at the age of 2 where the analysis began, and we truncated the age group until the age of 18. So that based on this 2 curve, you can see that they are quite nicely overlap in the earliest categories of the subadults, and afterward a bit of difference appearing in favor for the late Avar period, but actually there is no statistically significant difference between the probability of survival, quite the same between the 2 periods. But if we are focusing rather closely on different age categories, like where the largest difference appearing between the age of 7 and 12, there is a significant difference there. Of course, it can be a byproduct of the analysis, but with other factors, it can be explained why there is a shift in the survival probability in this later childhood phase. But for this juvenile phase, again, we do not have any kind of significant differences. Considering a bit of archaeological image with this survival pattern. So it's a very simplistic way. We just considered individuals, sub-adult individuals with grave goods and without grave goods. So it's a very binarized way, of course, I know that. It can be seen, and also it is a known phenomenon that there is an impoverishment in the funerary rite of the late Avar period. The amount of the objects put into the graves start to shrink quite significantly. Here you can see that basically the number of individuals without sub-adult individuals without any kind of archaeological objects is almost twice more in the late Avar period than in the early Avar period. But what we have seen before, that regarding this survival probability, we do not have the significant differences. So despite how the sub-adult traits is in the funerary rite, actually we can assume that during the life there is probably not so much difference how they are treated as sub-adults, because we do not have any kind of differences regarding the survival rates. Of course, we have the limitations, because we just modeling this archaeological information quite simplistically, and based on the presentation of Zsófia and what we have studied so far for the Kölked site, actually the number of the grave goods is an age-dependent phenomenon as well. So afterward, to have a bit of extra information about that. We have seen so far that there are no large differences in the early and the late phase of the Kölked-Feketekapu site, but to put into a bit wider context for the early Avar period, we do a comparison with two larger sites, more 100 individuals. One of them is the Szegvár from Transdanubia. It's one of the largest early Avar period cemetery in Transdanubia, and we put a late Roman period cemetery of Rácz telep as well into this kind of analysis. So, modeling again the survival probabilities, we have this phenomenon that the late Roman sample actually bears quite a comparable rate and slope for the survival rate and probability for the survival. But for the Szegvár side, what is quite striking to see that especially in the younger child, younger sub-adult group, that you can see that it declines much more steeply, even though afterward from the age of 8 and 10, the slope is quite the same as for the Avar Kölked site, or even for the late antique site, but there is a sudden change and a sudden dropout for survival probability for the youngest age group. To do this kind of comparative wider context analysis for the late Avar period samples, we incorporated again sites with more 100 individuals from the Transdanubian region, Dunaszentgyörgy and Kaposvár, and from the Transtisza region, one of the latest horizons of our period cemetery, the Artánt cemetery. That we can see here that those differences are actually not the striking that we have found, for example, with the Szegvár site, but you can see that from the same geographical region of Transdanubia, more or less the same, Dunaszentgyörgy and the Kaposvár sites shows again a quite significant and actually statistically significant differences, and especially it's appearing in the earliest age group of the subadults, and afterward the slope again quite similar than those that can be found in the late Avar period, and the Artánt site is actually showing more or less the same pattern as the late Avar period sample for the Kölked-Feketekapu site. Considering and transforming it into a bit more straightforward numbers, we just calculated the median age of death between the ages of 2 and 19, so 18. So because so far we just analyzed this pattern between the ages of 2 and 18, so this is the median age of age of death between the ages of 2 and 18, and of course with the corresponding confidence interval. And you can see here that, not so surprisingly, again, the Szegvár site shows the lesser value for that. But what is the meaning of the median age of death? Its median can be considered as a quantile as well. So basically it's at the midpoint. So it means that the subadult individuals between age of 2 and 18, 50% of them will die before the age of this median age of death, and 50% of them will survive this median age of death. This is the meaning of the median value. And you can see here this variability even in the early and the late Avar period, and basically it's not strictly related to the periods as well, and not strictly related to the geographic region, because we have the variability in Transdanubia as well, we have the variability in the early and the late Avar period too. So, but before we judge too harshly the good people of Szegvár site, for example, how they're handling the subadults, we have to consider what else can influence the number of young subadult individuals. And it's usually not related to mortality, but growth and fertility. Because if there is an increased growth rate and increased fertility, of course, there will be more deceased subadult individuals, especially in the earliest age categories. And if we analyze the P-index, which is quite a useful proxy to estimate growth and fertility, here you can see on the red circles the Kölked values. More or less the same in the early and the late phase. The green color just depicts for the early Avar period, the blue color for the late Avar period, and in this analysis, it's not really interesting, the longer border than Jepic in the 9th century afterward. But what is interesting, just to take a look for this value of the Szegvárarom dűlő site. Here you can see this point, which means, I mean, not directly translatable to growth rate and fertility, but means there is a larger value and larger level for growth and fertility of those sites. So probably in this case, the reason why we have found this quite significant difference is meaning that they are in a different demographic process. But with the explanation for the late Avar period sites, they are more or less have the same values as the late of the Kölked site, so that it cannot be explained those differences between the late Avar period Kölked and the others with the phenomenon of growth or differences in fertility. So, to sum up so far what we have based on osteology. It seems between the early and the late phase of Kölked there is no significant differences in growth rate and fertility. So there is a bit of demographic stability throughout the Avar period without the kind of transformation. Yeah, it's also testified by that there is no significant differences between the age distributions. So we have this constant age distribution through the period, which is very much typical for a stable population. Of course, we have a bit of difference. I had just showed you before. It can't be explained why different hazard rates for characteristic for different age periods of different subsistence strategies or changes between the two periods, but of course we do not have any kind of direct evidence based on that. So we can see that at least in the case of the Kölked-Feketekapu site, that despite the cultural transformation and the changes in the funerary customs, survival probability of non-adults remained rather unchanged. So this kind of transformation can't be observed directly in the survival probabilities and survival rate of the subadults. And for the wider Avar period context, that we can see that there is a different demographic scenarios in the early Avar period. So much difference is found in the early case of Kölked and the Szegvárarom dűlő, which probably might be explained by actually the very different history and very different origin of those people who founded those sites. Because in the early Kölked case, actually, it's a very groundly founded local communities existing just priorly of the Avar conquest. So actually, they already had a community before the arrival of the Avars. But in the case of the Szegvár case, they are much more closely related to the steppe-originated population, what is considered actually to be Avar. So they probably just start to settle down. And from the demographic sources, it's very much known that if there is a shift in the way of life and then there is a shift in the subsistence strategy, there will be some sort of response from the demographic profile as well. So regarding the late Avar period, that again, despite the transformation, the variability remained in the late Avar period. So no all kind of changes in the survival of the subadults can be explained by the transformation of the Avar period, because we still were able to see those large variability even within the same geographical location as well. Yes, for the Szegvár case, we have seen that the different survival probability might be related to population growth. So if we are observing any kind of increase in the number of the deceased subadults, we always have to consider this phenomenon of changing in fertility and the growth rate. And yes, the demographic processes varied in the early and the late Avar period, so I do not have a final answer to that. Probably in every case we have to analyze those studies independently from each other and case by case, and maybe there will be some patterns on micro-regional level, but globally on the Carpathian Basin we can't relate cultural transformation with the changes of the survival rate of the subadult individuals. And very briefly, I've just talked about osteology so far. But fortunately, we have a funded project to analyze this kind of research questions. So beside osteology and the age of death, we eventually, hopefully with the years, we will be able to incorporate the health status data for that, including the sex data for the subadults and the diet, and I mean a bit more extended data set than what we have so far, because the ERC focus mostly on the entire population level, but this project focus entirely on the subadults, so only subadult individuals will be studied with this isotopic analysis and the ADNA stuff. And thank you very much for your attention.